So let's start by setting a positive motivation. So, as we typically do for this class, we focus on generating a mind of confidence or faith, having studied the Buddha's wisdom, having tried to put it into practice and seen at least some results, and having understood the life stories of the great masters, the past and even present, those who also put the teachings into practice and achieved the results. Our confidence is based on experience, based on logic and reasoning. So we see the power of following the Buddha's teachings. We see it in part because we are trying to understand more and more deeply the concept of refuge, recognizing the Buddha as an unmistaken, non-deceptive guide, his teachings as a true path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And those who've achieved results that are further along on the path, particularly those who have been able to see emptiness directly as people on whom we can rely, as also valid, non-deceptive, and unmistaken. And we think that the reason that we are putting the teachings into practice is to be of limitless benefit to sentient beings. So these minds of refuge and bodhicitta, faith or confidence, we generate as our motivation. All right. So we ended last week, or the last session. Well, yeah, I guess it was last week too. It's both. With this discussion on ignorance. We're still in the section where the individual primary afflictions are being looked at individually. Any questions or thoughts from Thursday's class or this section not yet addressed? Okay, so day 244 is the next contemplation, and here Lama Zopa is going to discuss pride or deluded pride, as we, depending on how you want to frame it. The quotation is, pride is a negative, inflated, unrealistic attitude. And then in the commentary starts by saying that pride is a feeling of superiority. So that's what we said before, which distinguishes deluded pride from simply having pride. From being proud is not a problem as long as it doesn't give rise to a feeling of superiority. If on the basis of some accomplishment, some attribute, we hold ourselves above other sentient beings, then it's become deluded pride, and that's problematic. It's one of the root afflictions. And then he also, so that's one of the major reasons why it is an affliction, why it is problematic, is because interpersonally, it really, it causes condescension. It causes us to, look down on others. And importantly, too, it can really hold us back from being open, from learning, even from teachers, even from, the attitude, oh, well, I've heard, teachings on this topic before. And because I've heard it before, I don't need to hear it again. I don't need to go to this teaching because, someone said it to me once before a couple of years ago. And so that's good enough. Um, and if we have a direct, non-conceptual, meditative realization, well, then maybe, but if we don't, if we have just a purely kind of surface or intellectual understanding, then that attitude is really an obstacle for our spiritual lives. When we feel like, oh, I've already gotten that teaching before, I've already heard that, because, and what people point out is that any time that you go to the teachings, I mean, His Holiness is kind of probably not leaving India, maybe, anymore. But in years past, he traveled extensively, and of course that we can still hold out hope that he visits America again. But even in India, even when you look at the videos and things of him teaching in India, on the stage are all of these great teachers and people who are older. Even, I mean, His Holiness is relatively old, but people that are contemporaries that are even older, and that has always been true. Even when he was 40 and 50, people who were in their 70s and 80s who had been alive longer, teaching longer. They also would go up, and they were honored, to hear those teachings again from His Holiness, even though could be a teaching on impermanence, or it could be a teaching on a text that that they themselves also teach, to people, but they don't have that affliction in their mind of thinking, well, there isn't something more I can unlock from this, or more I can learn by hearing it again. And also, it also it we feel when this is arising in the mind, when this is part of the way that we're relating to the teachings, we don't want, even we feel like it's a failing, in a way, to ask a question or to try to seek some clarification. Is what Lama Zopa is also pointing out. Because we're like, well, maybe I don't fully understand it, but I can just research it more, or I'll just try to find more books and I'll just figure it out, just on my own. I can just go off and figure it out. Instead of, raising your hand and asking a question from the teacher, because we don't want other people to think that we don't know the answer to that, or so it's also, it isn't even that it's in relation. Pridefulness can also just be about how we're perceived. It isn't even necessarily in relation to the information itself. We might be really lost in a teaching, that we haven't heard, that is new, but the pridefulness comes in when we can't be seen as someone who isn't following, the material, who wants to be perceived as a really good student. And we lose an opportunity to have it explained by a great teacher, or, what have you. So as Lama Zopa points out, generally what they say in the teachings in terms of the antidote is to contemplate. So, of course, the direct antidote to pride is cultivating humility. And the way that you do that really is to spend time thinking about, in part, all of the things that you don't have any knowledge of, all of the things that you can't do, and don't know about. Because this idea of, superiority, you could be a neuroscientist, or you could be a great mathematician, or whatever it is. But if you're on an airplane that's having, engine trouble, well, then you need to know how to, only the person that knows how to fly the airplane well is of any real value in that moment, and your life is in their hands. And if you're lost in the woods or something, only someone who has knowledge about how to make a fire, how to, make shelter, how to gather food. Again, you might have a Nobel Prize, but at that moment you're at the mercy of another person who, hopefully that you can find, who understands survival tactics and so on. So it's to say that knowledge is only useful in particular contexts. If and then that person might have a heart attack, and if you're a heart surgeon, well, great, now your knowledge is useful. Now you can do that. But just because you're a heart surgeon and you have useful knowledge in a specific context doesn't validly mean that your ego should be inflated, in a general sense, that it doesn't translate to, like, I'm a better person just because in a specific context I have a specific skill set. Because we can think about, well, I don't know anything about astronomy or quantum mechanics or, ecosystems or cellular biology. I mean, there's so many topics that we have very little knowledge of, um, and then, of course, so that's one thing. And then in a spiritual context, as Lama Zopa points out, we should also really check, the depth of the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we don't have. Again, like I say, if you have fully qualified calm abiding and you've had direct meditative realizations of the Lamrim, then, okay, you're in a pretty good spot. But still, have you seen emptiness directly? Are you on the bodhisattva grounds and paths? Um, you know, there's still, even that is relatively early, in the overall spiritual journey. Getting calm abiding, if a person applies themselves for, in strict retreat, for a couple of years, I mean, they'll say 6 months, but probably, for us in the 21st century, it's not, we are so addicted to, um, technology and instant gratification. We have a lot more to overcome. But still, I mean, it's not that difficult if a person really wants to get fully qualified, calm abiding, probably in a few years of strict retreat, they could do it. And then a few years after that, they could have direct meditative realizations of the Lamrim, but still, or most of the Lamrim, but, are they on the Bodhisattva grounds? Probably not. Uh, so, and then, even a first level Bodhisattva compared to an eighth, ninth, 10th level Bodhisattva, huge differences in terms of how, how effective they can be to benefit sentient beings and so on. And then, of course, are we, how likely is it that we can say that I've closed the door to the lower realms is another thing that, Lama Zopa points out. That should be our main, one of our main concerns. Isn't, have I read this book, or have I been to this kind of retreat, but have I closed the doors to the lower realms or not? Is that, is that something that I can say I've accomplished? Because if not, then our death is kind of uncertain. There's a degree of uncertainty that's naturally going to arise at the time of our death, and that should be taking up kind of all of our focus, is making that work out well. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about deluded doubt or previous, anything that's someone's thought of?
Could you say, like, Venerable, could you say that it's relatable at all to the willingness to be vulnerable? So, like, not knowing is saying that I'm not solid anything. I'm not fixed. The same with like impermanence. It's a willingness to just not.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it is like a non-clinging, non-attachment to concept, including of our.
Yeah, so I mean, pridefulness is kind of like you're saying, it's kind of like a shield. It's sort of like a false, um, kind of like a false solidity. Like you're saying, well, like you're saying, an unwillingness to confront things that are uncomfortable about ourselves, about, you know, because we latch on to, well, I've done this and I've done this, and, but really, if we do have that sense of superiority, then it doesn't really come from a place of like real genuine strength, and like it comes from insecurity. It comes from like, well, this is the one thing that I can kind of latch onto and use that to say that, oh, because I have this one skill, or I've done this one thing, or these two or three. But you know we can think of all of the other things. I don't know anything. I'm not artistic. I can't sing. I can't, I'm not good at sports. There's all kinds of people who have all kinds of things, but we just sort of pick, this one thing to shield ourselves, because it's uncomfortable to think about all of the things that we don't know and can't do and aren't good at. But that's just realistic. That's not, and that's not to say that we should put ourselves down. Humility isn't to go like in the opposite direction and to say, oh, I'm the worst, in the world. It's just to be realistic and be like, yeah, I have these strengths, and that's fine, and that's useful. That is great. That helps me. I can use those in service of my spiritual practice, and in trying to be of benefit to others. And it's wonderful that I have that. But there's all of these other things here that, maybe they're not super significant, but again, in a different context, if you're in a burning building and you need to be carried out, than someone who's big and strong and like, they've spent time, generating that kind of endurance. That's really valuable. That's what you're going to value in that moment, not the intellectual person, not the, but the person that can literally just pick you up and put you over their shoulder and run out the door. That's what's important at that moment. So it's in every different context, there's a different skill or a different ability that has value. And so it's just, it's people don't want to think about all of the ways in which they, because we want to think, oh, I've got this all the time. We just want to think, oh, I'm impervious to, nothing can touch me. I can handle, this, because that's sort of the most comfortable way of thinking, not, you know, and like you're saying, like with impermanence or even death, we think the same thing. That's also just a comfortable fiction that, oh, I'm never going. We don't say that out loud, but we act that way. We act like I will live forever because, and so we feel comfortable distracting ourselves and doing meaningless things and kind of delaying everything and just sort of going along, because there isn't, even though we wouldn't say out loud, I'm never going to die, um, our actions are kind of in line with that subconscious or unconscious idea. And it's kind of the same thing with deluded pride. We just don't want to look at um, all of the places where we, we're not strong. Yes, Bade.
Hi, Venerable.
Hello.
So my question is, so for example, as one is advancing on the path and you know, say Bodhisattva reaches first ground and then eighth ground, and but one has to always stay humble. Um, but I was wondering, so humility is an antidote. How does joyous effort relate to um to this kind of combat pride?
So I think, so I mean, of course, in terms of the perfection of the perfection, the actual perfections, of course, seeing emptiness, directly really helps, overcome the ego in general, and it really undermines all of the disturbing attitudes to a great degree. So, once you've, seen that, then of course you don't have any of the same issues in the same way. So the bodhisattvas, when they're practicing, all of their perfections, they are, mixing that with emptiness, and that's quite helpful. For us, to the degree that we are trying to engage, in these practices, I think the fact that there is that bodhicitta motivation, also, with or without emptiness, um, is also really helpful, if because it takes the focus off of oneself. It takes the point of engaging in the practice, um, from it being self-centered in general. So I think the more, since we don't have, a realization of emptiness, and of course we don't have a realization of bodhicitta either in terms of direct, non-conceptual meditative, um, but the more that we can remind ourselves of both to some degree, but maybe bodhicitta more so, really kind of depends on a person's temperament and, some, and in terms of the actual technical bodhisattvas, sometimes bodhisattvas will realize bodhicitta before they realize emptiness. Sometimes they'll realize emptiness before they realize bodhicitta. But I think that the more that we can just focus on our practice not being for oneself, and giving, and then, so motivating well and then dedicating well, those I think that's sort of the technology that's built into formal practice that's really helpful, because on both ends of anything that we're doing, we're creating a really altruistic motivation. And then at the end, we're giving away everything that we did for the benefit of sentient beings. But of course, it's true that the ego can certainly co-opt, our spiritual practice. But like I say, those are meant to kind of be the safeguards. They're kind of meant to be the technologies that we should be taking advantage of. But it's certainly true that just like with anything else, we can use our Dharma practice to put ourselves above, like, oh, I took time out of my day. All of these other, peasants, what did they do today? They just, they just wasted their time. And, so of course, there's always a danger that our spiritual practice can feed the delusions rather than be an antidote to the delusions. But again, that's where realizing, all of the, putting in that sense, to some degree, we also need to put the focus on ourselves in a different way, meaning, am I, like I said before, have I really closed the door to the lower realms? Am I really safe? Is my death something that I'm 100% confident that I can face with no danger arising? And if that's not true, then we need to get to work, on that, and that, reminding ourselves of that, so in one way, it's putting the focus on others in terms of our, what we are accomplishing, but then also simultaneously putting the focus on ourselves in terms of, I still have this delusion, I still have this affliction, I still today even, well, like when we're doing purification practice, I made this mistake and I accidentally raised my voice in this, so I have so far to go, as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
May I bounce a question off of Bade's question? So Bade had asked about joyous effort, which is not a term I feel really deeply familiar with. Is that relating to, like, almost starting from a place of recognizing our own Buddha nature so that we're kind of lifted up a bit?
So joyous effort is one of the 6 perfections. And so in one way of speaking, it's kind of what all of the perfections are, what bodhisattvas are doing with their lives. They're training in the 6 perfections. But as if a person's practicing in the Mahayana tradition, then of course, they're, even though they're not a bodhisattva, perhaps, that's the ideal, though, that's the bodhi, of course, because that's the most immediate ideal, and then you on the basis of that you become a Buddha, but that's what your sort of most immediate goal is. And so of course, practicing patience and practicing ethics and practicing concentration and all of the perfections are things that practitioners in general. So what it means is the technical definition is just sort of delighting in spirituality, kind of taking delight in persevering in Dharma practice, and kind of joyously engaging, not seeing meditation and study as like this thing I have to do, because I was told to do it, but really feeling that like it's extraordinary that today I get to engage in this meditation, or what have you. So overcoming kind of laziness and kind of just the busy, and even because one form of laziness from the Buddhist perspective is filling your time with kind of just mundane things. So thinking, not making time for your practice because you're like, oh, well, I have to go to the bank, and then I have to go to the grocery store, and then, I have to go to, and I spend so much time at work, and not prioritizing your practice and making space in your life for it. So busyness is a form of laziness from the Buddhist perspective, if it's focused on, like just having hobby, like, I'm a stamp collector and I travel the world, collecting stamps, or, or I like, I have to follow a band around the country, and like go to, not to say, don't have hobbies or don't do things you enjoy, but just don't let it get out of control, or to the point where it's crowding out, the time and energy that you can devote to spiritual practice. You can strike a balance, but some people, kind of maybe just go in one extreme, and like they spend all of their time trying to understand about, butterflies and the migration patterns of butterflies, and like it's not that important, like, from the Buddhist perspective, that kind of mundane knowledge, and it's not that helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so day 245 is on doubt or deluded doubt. And so there's three kinds of doubt. So in general, doubt is a mind that is what they call two-pointed, thinking, well, the Buddha says that the Four Noble, the Four Noble Truths is a genuine reflection of how Aryas see reality, that, enlightenment is possible, that, the ordinary unenlightened state is caused by afflictions and karma. There are statements that are made, that are presented as truths about how things are, how reality, karma, etc. And when doubt is arising in the mind, then we may be, there's two kinds of doubt, or three kinds of doubt. So there's doubt trending in the wrong direction, which is, well, the Buddha says this about karma, it's possible that it's true, but it's probably not true. It's probably made up. It's probably false. That's doubt that's tending, or tending in the wrong direction. Then there's equal doubt, where you get a teaching on karma, and you're like, well, I have no idea. Like, this tradition, this religion says this, and then but this other religion says, well, I just have to I have to understand God's will, and I have to supplicate myself to God's will, and that's the engine that will drive my next life, rather than karma. And so I have no idea. Like, one person is saying this, one person is saying that, or one religious tradition is saying that, or one philosophy, and it could just be either one. I can't figure it out. that's equal doubt. And then you have doubt trending in the right direction, where you're like, "Oh, the Buddha said this, and I'm not sold on it, but I have some confidence in the Buddha. Other people that I trust and that I have great respect for, they're saying that this is something that is valid, and so it's probably, I'm not sure, but probably it's true." And of course, so doubt trending in the right direction is better, of course, than those other two types of. So we want to kind of be progressing more and more in developing confidence. So this is not so equal doubt and doubt tending in the wrong direction. They're not just like analyzing things, or just, it isn't being skeptical or not taking, not just deciding, well, whatever I'm being told, I will just accept because it was said to me. So questioning and analyzing and checking, of course, those are all critical steps on the path. But if we prejudge something, and we don't put it in the context of, what don't I understand? What more information do I need to get? What is it that would help me to understand this better? If instead we just say, well, this probably isn't true, then we've prejudged it, and that's harmful to our spiritual path. Whereas analyzing, checking, trying to find out more, trying to understand more deeply, those are all critically important aspects of the teachings. But so it's particularly doubt trending in the wrong direction that is the most problematic. And that's really what we want to try to avoid, is coming to some view that some teaching of the Buddha is wrong, or is probably wrong. But just kind of holding an inquisitiveness, holding a sense of wanting to understand more and more deeply, that's fine. We're not required to come to some sort of firm, unshakable conclusion. But what would that look like? What do I need to be able to do that? Am I interested in trying to, like, taking it as a hypothesis and saying, well, if this is true, how do I validate it? What do I need to do to demonstrate that it is true? And then, if by following that inquisitive, open mind of inquiry, if we prove that it's false, then we're free to reject it. Then we're free not to, include it. But just to look at it and then immediately say, well, I don't think that's true or valid or accurate, that can be a real obstacle to growth. Any questions about doubt? Okay. Okay, so now Lama Zopa is going to talk about wrong views. And there are different kinds of wrong views. And so he's going to look at these individually. Wrong views is technically kind of an umbrella term. And there's 5 particular kinds of wrong views. The first is the view of the changeable aggregates, here also usually called the transitory collection. It means the same thing, but most of the time you'll see it, I think, as the view of the transitory collection, but means exactly the same thing as changeable aggregates. He says this is the foundation of the other wrong views. So this is clinging to a self, clinging to an I that we superimpose on top of the body and mind. So there is a body, there is a mind conventionally, and they are associated, and we conventionally label the I on that collection. But when we hold that label to be really solid, really independent, truly existent, then we have inflated that what's true about that. So the changeable aggregates, and so changeable or transitory, is getting at each time we take rebirth, we appropriate a different set of aggregates, a different, the mind is expressed in a very different way, because if you go from human to animal, or you go from animal to human, it's the same kind of root consciousness in either case, but it's expressed in a very, very different way due to the specific incarnation that's manifesting at that time. And then, of course, the body of a human, the body of an animal, also very, very different aggregates. So this particular body and mind, the way that the mind is being expressed through this particular body over the course, and of course, it's even markedly different over the course of a single human lifetime, because we have the same mind now that we did when we were 2. Our mind didn't change. We just we're just able to express our mind differently now than we could when we were 2. So even over the course, and a person can have a stroke, a person can have a car accident, a person can develop dementia. All kinds of things can, of course, then negatively impact how the mind is expressed through the body. So really, I mean, it's transitory even within a lifetime in many cases, but also, of course, between lifetimes, we appropriate very, very different aggregates. But each time as long as we're an ordinary sentient being, we're going to cling to that transitory collection in a way that is diluted, in a way that doesn't comport with reality. We're going to superimpose a solid, permanent sense of I on the body and mind. Okay, and so then any questions? I mean, of course, like that's one of the essential main topics of Buddhism. So of course, we could talk about the view of the transitory collection for hours and hours. I mean, I couldn't, because I would run out of things to say pretty quickly, but it could be analyzed for years. But any questions about the view of the transitory collection? So then the second
Sorry.
is, yes.
So let me get this straight. It's what that means is this is I. Is that correct? Like
You
I'm
turned
pointing to myself.
your camera off. I think you were trying to just so there's the conventional self, which isn't a problem. The conventional self is the fact that we have a body and we have a mind, and they are connected. When they cease to be connected, we call that death, because the mind will leave the body and will take rebirth. And we also conventionally understand that, because we don't refer to a corpse as being that person anymore. We would say, oh, that's John's body. But we don't say, well, John's right there. We don't say John's in the casket, because we even intuitively know that when the mind is gone, that person is gone. We would just refer, oh, that's John's body. Like that's the flesh and blood, and but it's not John anymore. So conventionally, the fact that body and mind are existent phenomena and that they are working together, they're connected, is the conventional self. And the conventional self is fine, is not a problem. The problematic issue is the view of the transitory collection. So maybe it's because in English it's a little bit not as it's maybe it might be better to say like the diluted view of the transitory, like, or the false view. They really just call it the view of the transitory. That's what it's translated into English as, but it might be more helpful to add the word like diluted view, or because there is a realistic view. There is a healthy, normal, like non-diluted view that is possible for like that high-level bodhisattvas would have about their own transitory collection. But there is an ordinary view. There is the diluted view, and that's the view that we have, which isn't that there is body and mind connected, but that there's a real, permanent, solid, unchanging ego identity that exists almost like over and above, or is in charge of both body and mind simultaneously, is like the owner of body and mind, that there is a findable, real, permanent essence of I. Because again, even in one lifetime, like, where is that? How can we say that when I was an infant versus right now, that's really truly the same person? It's the same. It's 2 points on a continuum that's continuing. But how can we? But we have that idea that I've always been me and I will always be me, and even when we change, so it's kind of. But we were very different when we were in first grade and 5th grade, but the mind has this kind of way of papering over, like in real time, all of these subtle ongoing changes that are happening to maintain a false kind of permanent ego identity, even though there's nothing that we can point to as being why that's valid. And again, kind of like what we've been saying, it's more comfortable. It's in the same way that having diluted pride is more comfortable than facing what we don't know, in the same way that subconsciously or unconsciously acting as though we'll never die is more comfortable than facing the fact that everything that we think and know and conceive ourselves to be on a course level is going to slip away at some point, is more, that's uncomfortable, and we don't face that. There's a groundlessness to just the fact that body and mind are existent phenomena that are presently interrelated and presently manifesting in a particular way, that wasn't like that really even earlier in this life, but certainly wasn't like that in my previous life, will be very different in my next life. Facing that is also really uncomfortable, and we don't do it. We hold on to a fiction, another kind of cognitive fiction of a real, permanent, independent identity that is somehow that which owns both the body and the mind simultaneously. It's like, and like Venerable Rabina says, we don't need that. That's not necessary. It's not necessary to posit the owner of body and mind, because everything that I am is explainable with body and mind. There is nothing that needs to be the owner of body and mind. There is body, there is mind, but everything that I can think and say and do is just what comes from body and mind. But that introduces a lot of dynamism and flexibility and change, and it's not as comfortable to grasp as it is to just think, well, I'm me, and so the conventional self, like I said, both kinds of self, the conventional self and the diluted, kind of permanent self, they're both posited on the body and mind, but one is just realistic and not exaggerating, and the other is adding a lot on top of body and mind. Okay, so then the second diluted view is called the view of extremes. Lama Zopa says, it is our view of things and events as being either permanent and independent, which is called eternalism, or not existing at all, which is called nihilism. So falling into one of the two extremes, either holding, eternalism is generally, is more related to the first, the view of the transitory collection, holding the self to be this permanent, entity. That's eternalism, the extreme of eternalism. And that's what people generally are struggling with. But then when people start to think about the nature of reality, and they start to think about what's called the object of negation, then for meditators, there can be the danger of falling into nihilism, which is where you negate too much. You go in the other extreme and you think, well, the Buddha, because everything is empty, then nothing exists. Then nothing exists at all, not even conventionally. And then you deny that, like, karma is a functioning process, because nothing exists. So you have to also not go too far when you're trying to come back from eternalism. You don't then want to slip into thinking, well, the Buddha must be saying that everything is just made up by the mind, that nothing is true, nothing is valid, nothing has any functioning. That would be falling into the other extreme of nihilism. And then the next is the view of holding deluded views as supreme. So that's just like being inflexible about any, he says, through believing that any of the other four deluded views are the correct viewpoint. So, because certainly in other religious traditions and things, they would posit, that there is a real findable soul, and and so on, and that's what has only one additional rebirth into either heaven or hell, or so if we're not willing to look at any of our deluded views, and we're just like, we're happy with them, and we think, well, no, I'm correct, and I don't need to analyze, I don't need to look at that and think about that, that would be holding deluded views as supreme. And then the fourth is the view of holding our own misguided moral and religious discipline as supreme. So this is holding any holding to any action that violates kind of a basic tenet of ethics, and thinking that by holding to that, we will achieve some sort of spiritual good. So could be animal sacrifice, could be human sacrifice, could be, I don't, stoning someone, some sort of violence in, thinking that, or some sort of ritual cleansing that is actually harmful to someone, or, exorcisms where, maybe a person is denied food, or, they're starved, or so anything that where, and it isn't to say, if a person, wants to hold a different religious views, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if in service of those views, they actually kill or, injure other living beings, then the Buddhist view would be that, and they believe that that is the, or blowing yourself up, to go to heaven or something. Those are all examples of holding misguided moral and religious discipline as supreme. Anything, if it doesn't cause any harm, then fine, do hold whatever religious views you want. But if you're actually killing or maiming or injuring or, causing real, genuine harm to other living beings, and you're seeing that as a path to your salvation, that's a real problem from the Buddhist perspective. And then there's the deluded view called wrong view, which is rejecting, in a way, kind of, related to doubt, but just fully rejecting any of the Buddha's teachings. So rejecting the idea of karma, following, propitiating some, deity as the engine that drives what happens, rather than the view of karma, or holding to holding to seeing things as permanent. Because again, like I say, some traditions would say that you do have, only one, that, you were born into just this life, and you have a soul, and then that soul is your real true findable essence, and that real true findable essence only has one destiny, in either, heaven or hell. That would be to see things as existing from its own side, to see things as having, inherent existence. And that would, certainly, I mean, it's definitely true that a person who holds to that could absolutely engage in a lot of very positive action in the world. They may make a lot of progress in developing love and compassion, and for a particular person in a particular lifetime, that may be the most suitable vehicle that they need, and is appropriate for them to make spiritual progress. Certainly, it could help them to avoid a lower realm rebirth in their next lifetime, and so there's many beneficial effects, but it is also feeding the root delusion of fundamental ignorance, and so it's not allowing them directly to make progress toward enlightenment in that lifetime. But still, it isn't our place to question the value that that might have in a larger context of you know, creating eventual causes and conditions. But maybe, you know, for people for whom the Buddhist teachings are suitable, that might be a more direct, you know, you can kind of bypass, maybe do it a little bit more effectively, because you're really getting at not just developing love and compassion and generosity, and, you know, because all of the religious traditions can help people, all of the mainstream, you know, they can all help people, but seeing emptiness directly is pretty unique. So if we can get, if that is suitable as a vehicle for oneself, then maybe that's a bit more direct in actually creating the causes and conditions of enlightenment. Because Buddhism, you know, would say that we can't make the argument that every religious tradition directly leads to enlightenment in the same way. But again, like I said, you know, it's not suitable, you know, not, you know, there are people for whom they'll never become Buddhist in that lifetime. And so the vehicle of Christianity or whatever might be a wonderful vehicle that helps them to create causes and conditions of good future rebirths by learning love and compassion and so on. Okay, any thoughts or questions about these wrong views, deluded views?
I'm just thinking that in light of wrong views, and companionship really does matter, because it's really easy, even not wanting to be influenced, to be influenced by views that others are putting forth. And sometimes they
Yeah,
expect that. So
yeah. I mean, there's certainly a degree of courageousness that's required to stick to a path that isn't, you know, in the mainstream and isn't what our friends are doing and isn't, you know, because, you know, in very you know, well-meaning ways, or, you know, kind of what they are considering to be innocuous, you know, they can kind of be knocking, you know, parts of the path, you know, kind of to the wayside. And um, you know, just by encouraging alcohol consumption or, you know, various sorts of things, or help, you know, feeding our, because we're all stuck, you know, they're stuck, we're stuck, and, you know, and if we're not surrounding ourselves by people who are really trying to get unstuck, then just the fact that they're not kind of, and of course that doesn't, you know, we shouldn't reject friends and family and people because they have a different, but, you know, we also have um, to have that clarity in our own mind about this is my path. And, you know, and so to spend time, you know, with like-minded people too, as you're saying, is really important, because otherwise they might encourage us to gossip, or because that's just sort of normal and that's what people do. And, you know, so to spend time around people who are actively trying not to do those things is really important. Having that fellowship. Okay, we are out of time for today. Any final thoughts or questions? So we'll just end with dedication. So we will recollect our motivation and think that by having listened and contemplated, we've actualized that motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind. And when that positive energy ripens, it will bring about beneficial effects. So we think very clearly about the spiritual beneficial effects that we wish to offer our practice as causes for the creation of. Just on your own, try to very clearly dedicate your efforts. All right. I will see everybody on Thursday.